For me, this is the question. It's balancing, and what we've been just talking about, balancing cost containment with long-term planning. And I must admit, I approach this with a little bit of, and I want you to feel this as well, a bit of impatience and agitation, because this has been the question for as long as I can remember, and I'm getting quite old now, this issue of cost containment. We're obviously up against demographic pressures, aging populations, comorbidity, rising demand and expectation, healthcare inflation, and that's been the issue for at least 30 years. And we've got this need to plan and reform, and that's kind of not been happening. All these things about prevention, about efficiency, have just not. We waste 20 to 40%, this is OECD and WHO figures, of our healthcare resources are wasted in our health system. So we've got to do something about it, and that's what we're here to discuss, and that's why I'm feeling a little bit agitated. So you know, I really want to get to the bottom of this, and so it's not a recent problem. It's not because of our inflation now. It's not because of the austerity after the 2008-9 collapse. It's just with us, and we've got to deal with it. So to talk about this, I'd like to welcome, please, Benedict Makonkuni, Chief Policy Strategist at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, Henrietta Richter, Managing Partners, Sofinova Partners, Richard Robinson, Executive Director, Market Access and External Affairs, BMS UK and Ireland, and Santiago Calvo Ramos, who is Health Policy Analyst and Economist, DG ECFIN, the European Commission. And I just should mention, thank you to BMS for sponsoring this session. So forgive my slight agitation at the beginning of this, but I really do feel this is the critical question we have to answer. I think I may start, Santiago, you're online. I think I'll start with you. So can you give us a sort of a flavour? I like to think we're still part of Europe. Give us a flavour for what's happening in Europe in terms of this need to cost contain, which is a reality, the limited resources, but also to plan for the future epidemiology and the future and the reforms that we need.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a really, really good question. I mean, we are currently in a situation where expenditure on healthcare has increased a lot due to the pandemic. Now it's growing a little bit less, but we're still dealing with issues of inflation and workforce, and actually that sets us up in terms of already in the short term having basically expenditure pressures. In the long run, we expect very much aging to actually really increase this sort of dynamics. And so what we're doing is that we are working with member states to increase the efficiency of the healthcare systems. We used to do that in terms of recommending reforms, and now we actually have investment available as well for member states to invest in some of these areas like digitalization, fight against cancer, and simply measures that can help healthcare systems become more efficient. So we're in a situation in which as well the debt level of countries have increased tremendously due to all of this absolutely legitimate expenditure that took place during the first years of the pandemic, and we're trying to basically make systems more efficient so that in the long run they can cope better with all of these expenditure pressures. But it's a tough fight.
Okay, so maybe these efficiency measures is something that we need to look at, because that's part of what the long-term planning should be aiming to address. Benedict, can I ask you about, I mean, the Tony Blair Institute, I know, is working on these sort of big ticket issues and you know, health reform and efficient health systems is part of that. What's your take? And we face one-year budget cycles, we face four-year political cycles, we face structural silos in terms of the Department of Health, and yet most of our health is determined by things that are not to do with health, they're to do with education. And so, yeah, it's a big question, and how do we overcome some of those challenges?
Yeah, so look, to start with, I mean, I share your agitation. And I think one of the big questions that we are, I mean, if you just look at the basic, facts of it, you've got up to 44% of public expenditure on healthcare today. Tax continues to rise to meet that demand, and there's no way to seemingly break that cycle. And quite often when we present this, people push back and say that's kind of the natural process of aging demographics, etc. And look, that is right, but that's why we all need to address that challenge, because it's a challenge that many, many countries are facing. And you can't just look purely at the economics, of course, because at the same time, what you want to be achieving is better patient outcomes and better care outcomes. And so I know that sounds almost a utopian proposition, right? Lower cost, better outcomes, but that is the objective I think we need to get to today. So I think there are a few elements that you need to begin to focus on this. And for a long time, we thought about areas such as prevention rather than cure. I think number one on that, you begin to have some of the potential digital infrastructure that can begin to deliver that at scale today. There's a really, really hard task of implementation and delivery on that, but the more that you can collect the right kind of data, the more that you can have care closer to the person, the more that you can actually decentralize some of the way that you deliver care today. We don't need some of the huge kind of capital infrastructure that we need if you can begin to get more community-based models and with a tighter relationship between your physician and the patient, as well as just thinking about just some of those quite, some of them we're a bit of the way off them becoming, really decent medical devices, but even things like wearables and other areas are beginning to show, potential huge medical upsides in the long run, the data that they can collect and the monitoring that they can do. So I think there's a whole kind of rescale imagining of how we actually do healthcare delivery today, how we, actually get the utility of data, how we can derive better patient care diagnostics and therapeutics for it, as well as actually stimulate industry and biotech, which then hopefully creates a bit more of a virtuous cycle of healthcare delivery as well.
Okay, I like that overview, and I want to sort of explore that a bit more. I mean, these things we've been talking about, we talked about a lot today, many of these things. Is it really around, is the issue about investment of money, or is it about changing the way we think and changing practices? And maybe you would like, Henrietta.
Sure, I can start. So just for the benefit of everyone here, I am a managing partner to Finova Partners in Paris, which is a venture capital firm that invests in startups, but all the way into the growth of biotech companies, but also medtech companies and companies in sustainability, so industrial biotech, so that's the background. And we've been doing that for 50 years, and so launched approximately 500 companies at this point in time. And I think that a very important point of this discussion is actually what innovation and biotech can feed into the efficiency and how we think about making partnerships. That was also discussed at the previous session. If you look at, just take the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, where you had 2 of the 3 vaccine providers being biotech companies. And I don't think that was a coincidence at all, because what you do learn in biotech is being adaptable and agile, right? And so being able to basically turn around the entire workforce and focus on one thing, that's something you're trained in as a biotech team. And I think that's why we need to, I think those 2 examples of Moderna and BioNTech in Germany, of course, teaming up with very large pharma companies, but still, had it not been for those 2 biotech companies, how would it look now, right? And so continues to invest in this community and in this sector is really, really important. Of course, I mean, bringing up the pandemic is another part of that, namely the partnerships. Of course, the VC community and the biotech or medtech communities can't do it themselves, right? We are completely dependent on the academic world from the spin-outs of the science and the innovation. We are depending on the pharma companies to partner with. We are depending on the public market to have the full circle, right? But when we see that happen efficiently, we also see almost an exponential positive effect on that. And I think the vaccines was a very good example of that.
I think that's a great point. I think we only need to look back 3 years to the pandemic. So many speakers have referenced those times to see the dangers, the risks of cost containment gone wrong, of many years of salami slicing and underfunding of health systems, which caused so many problems at the heart of the pandemic. But also to see the benefits and the advantages of investment in innovation, of cross-sectoral working across public and private sectors, of agile and flexible regulation, and of using data incredibly smartly to track disease and to respond almost in real time, working with the support and the understanding of the public and patients.
So that sort of partnership, and I mean, it's almost like you've got instruments in the orchestra. You've got government, you've got the third sector, you've got industry, diagnostics, medtech, biotech. They are instruments in orchestra. They all behave in certain ways, inevitably because of what they are. So how? I just want to. This is a question for all of you, but maybe for you, Richard. Is we know we need to get more prevention. We need to be invested in prevention and then in diagnosing early, so we're avoiding these expensive conditions. We know we need greater efficiency within pathways of care. We need digitalization and data that will enable us to identify those inefficiencies and then fix them. So if we're trying to set out what each instrument should be doing in that, and then preparing for epidemiology that's coming our way, that is predictable in many ways. Some of it's unpredictable. Well, we know there will be another pandemic. We don't know what it will be, but so. Yeah, so how do those instruments work together? How can we leverage those best is the question. Maybe I'll ask you, Richard, first, and then we can, Yeah,
I'll continue the analogy. A good orchestra needs a conductor, and we need central coordination, a conductor who will bring together these different elements of society and focus them in the right areas. You talked about government as perhaps being one instrument. I don't think it is. I think there are many, many different departments with different roles and responsibilities to play if we're going to ramp up our public health interventions across society and ensure that we're more resilient and healthier and better able to respond to the next pandemic.
Any other thoughts along these lines about how they operate? Maybe from European perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think these are issues that, of course, also occur at a European level, and simply at the level of any of any European country, because there's always this dance that you have between between all the different actors involved. Of course, I'm more aware of the one between government and, for example, the pharmaceutical industry, and how you want, as government, you want to ensure that you actually buy the medicines in the most cost-effective way possible, but at the same time that you actually reward innovation, so that this innovation that is actually producing this extension in life expectancy, that is helping us deal with a pandemic in this case, can actually keep delivering these new solutions to the different problems we have. So it's always a difficult dance. It's always difficult to know whether you've got it right, but you have to keep working at it, and you have to keep trying to optimize how you do it, so that you can have both the cost effectiveness and the innovation.
Do you want to?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of points, and I really agree with what's been said. And I think, if we take this back to the COVID example, right? One of why we got the mRNA vaccine so quickly was because of investment in public infrastructure and the genomic sequencing going up onto a public access database so quickly, which then allowed biomedical innovation to happen. And so I think one of the big questions around this, of how you build these kind of partnerships and how you co-create around this, is seeing it from both sides, right? Because the more that we build this the right kind of public infrastructure, the right kind of digital infrastructure, the more that you will begin to see the benefits of stimulation in biotech, etc. But I think the big question, which Richard alluded to as well, is that to actually get to that point, you need to get the public trust in the utility of the data, and what they're sharing is, got trust within that. I think one of the things that we've then thought about at the Institute then is, there's obviously a lot of ways that companies are coming in and working with the sector, I think, which is really, really important. But ultimately, what you have to do is push the ownership of the data onto the individual. So I own, I control, and I share my data so that they feel comfortable with the trust, but then you can then unlock the wider benefits of working with the companies and create what I think is actually, ultimately then you create a lot of value both off the data from the individual perspective, off an economic perspective, and actually from the health perspective as well. But I think you only unpick that question really quite deeply if you put that down to the individual level, so they own and feel like they can trust where their data, and they have control and responsibility for that.
Is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, no, it's a slightly different comment, but it was what you said, Rich, is that I think, and to give you some very real examples from what we see in our portfolio companies in terms of partnership and where we see I would call it a change, but it started years back, is most of our companies today, for example, have either collaborations or pharma companies in the syndicate. And many of them, especially, of course, in the early stage, can go many ways, right? It could be oncology, it could be inflammation, it could be, you choose. But because we start with the fundamental science, and very often it lends itself to multiple indications. And so what we're starting to see now is also the pharma companies coming in and sharing their data. So basically saying, when you have this mode of action or this modality, let's look into our database with thousands and thousands of patients over the years and look at how could the gene profile we're looking at there, whether it's RNA, whether it's protein, or how does that match up to what this company is doing, and let's try and find the best indication so we get fastest to the patients. That was not going on 10 years ago, I think, between biotech and pharma. And that's a huge improvement. Another thing we are seeing also in collaboration with pharma, but also with academic, is how we stratify patients. And in the previous session, there was this question, should we funnel money one direction to go towards the where we might have the problems? And I would, from a personal perspective, I would say absolutely not. And it's because very often we see that one drug is found in one connection, but 10 years later, we actually use it in a completely different indication. And so those kind of innovation comes from not necessarily trying to direct the end answer, right? And so if we start funneling money to say, obesity, let's take that as an example, right? That's a market which we're seeing an increasing interest in from all sectors, of course, because of the GLP-1s now coming to patients. But that project, that structure and compound started 25 years ago in both Novo Nordisk and Lilly, and it was projects in the drawer that nobody was allowed to work on, right? And so I think we need to, when it comes to innovation, not guide too much, but then once we start seeing data, we need to let those data plug in and direct us. I think that's the important part. And then a last comment in terms of stratifying, and that's where digital health comes in, right? I think it was said about 2% of the data being used of everything we know, right? And that's, of course, daunting, but we are going into a future where the number will increase. And I think we will come into a future very, very soon where you're not going to be able to do a trial unless you can show from a data perspective that these patients that you're selecting for that specific trial will benefit. Because right now we are doing all comers, we're doing all sorts of more open trials in order to pick out the data, right? But or to pick out some efficacy from the compounds. But what we see in most of our biotech companies, it must be the same in your hands, right? Is that we absolutely need to get to the right patient population immediately, both because of the cost perspective, the time, and the efficiency at the end of the day, right? And that's coming. And in 5 years' time, this would be a different conversation, I think.
Okay, I'm going to ask a very direct question of all of you. Is and I think you touched on it, which is, if we do the long-term planning right, do you think we can have better health, given the challenges that we face at aging and all the rest of it, better health at sort of pretty constant or affordable costs? Or are we stuck in, if we do the planning right, and then the next question after that is, what are those elements of the planning that we need to get right? So it's a yes or no question first.
Yes, I'm an optimist always by heart.
Okay.
Absolutely, yes.
Yes.
I would agree, yeah.
Okay. Oh, well, I was hoping someone would say no. Okay, right, fine.
More friction here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. All right. So you all agree. Now the question is, so what are those elements of long-term planning? I'd love it in list form. What are the elements of long-term planning that will enable us to deliver better health at affordable costs, at 10, 12% of GDP, ongoingly? Sorry, let me direct it to someone. Let me ask you.
Okay, yeah. Of course, these are the classic things that we can always do. So, of course, we've all spoken about prioritizing prevention. That's a classic. Effective budgeting governance. That is something that actually sounds incredibly simple, but it's actually extremely difficult to ensure that the budget for a hospital is the correct one. because the level of demand will change, will depend on random and not random factors. It will be stochastic. And so to ensure that this money is being well spent is very, very difficult. And many countries are really, really struggling with that and have huge overruns. And we would be able to manage that much better if budgeting was well done. Then, of course, integrated care, which is the other one that we always hear, for many years at this type of conferences. But it's still incredibly, incredibly important that different parts of the system talk to each other and they center around the needs of the patient. And same with social care and the interface between healthcare and social care. That's very, very important as well. Then as well, benchmarking performance. In the previous panel, there was David Morgan from the OECD, and we are working with them and with Eurostat to actually improve the data that we have on how healthcare systems work at European level. And I think this kind of work is very, very important, because if you have data, you can benchmark and you can see when you're doing better than others or not, and where are actually the areas where you could actually improve your efficiency. So that's a bit of a flavor of the sorts of things I'm thinking. Workforce planning as well. But yeah, I mean, a lot of these are eternal questions, but I think that if we could advance on them and make progress on them, that would take us part of the way towards making our systems more efficient and keeping expenditure around, 10% or something like that.
Okay, and maybe add to that if you wish. So in the interest of time, don't recapitulate, but maybe if there's anything.
I think there was a great list.
Yeah.
I'd add, the societal returns on this investment in healthcare. So long-term sickness costs the UK economy £43 billion a year, 2% of GDP. We only need to start making some inroads into that to start getting some really impressive returns on that investment. I'm quite attracted by taking a climate change type approach. This is a fundamental societal long-term problem. What can we learn from the approach to climate change? Having independent bodies, independent committees set up to span that political life cycle that causes us so much problems in terms of short-term investments. Announcements of 50 new hospitals, for example, when what we need is a long-term 50-year mission approach to improve public health.
And should that be national or international or both?
Well, if you take the climate change example, then it would be both.
Yeah. Henrietta?
Yeah, maybe just add again from the biotech perspective and the investor perspective, of course, continues to increase instead of decreasing the investment in the disease understanding. I cannot, underline enough how important finding the right patients when you go into those trials, that takes decades sometimes, right? How that would decrease cost and decrease the timelines, and all feeding into a high efficiency. And then the other thing is continue focusing, and it's been said many times, but it is really important, the exchange between these different actors in the environment, whether it's pharma, whether it's biotech, whether it's academia. And I want to give an example from the Nordic region, where we have seen the Novo Nordisk Foundation really setting up the last 10 years, I think more than 10 innovation centers, and I know that several pharma companies has done the same, but this is coming out of sort of an academic angle, and there is no return on investments, I mean, from an equity perspective, right, into those initiatives. And then lately, also setting up Bioinnovation Institute, and how that has been done is really taking complementary experience and competences in. And so the exchange of people between entities is really important. And that's another comment I want to make. And it's a very soft one, but I think it's quite important, at least for the sector I represent here today, is to accept that if we want to get better at making new drugs for patients, we also need to accept an attrition rate. And with the attrition rate comes failures, right? And so trying mentally also to accept that if you are in biotech or if you are in academia and you're embarking on an unknown project, you could call it, because none of us knows, it's a high risk area, right? That it's actually okay to fail.
Yeah.
Because if we can't accept that, and if we can't embrace the people that fails on these missions, we won't learn fast enough to get to these 5 years improvement, right? I think that's a very, very important. It's for all of us, right, to consider.
Right. Okay.
I agree with everything. I'll just add one point, which is invest in the right infrastructure. Because, I mean, there was a story last week in the Times Health Commission, which still slightly blows my mind, which is the NHS is spending £1 billion a year just on storing paper in warehouses. And you know, the NHS and Milton Keynes were like, well, we just digitize this and then we create a lot more space for actual medical service delivery rather than keeping fusty old health records in our sort of basement. And I think it's just a really simple example, but of actually where we're still so far behind on actually modern infrastructure in lots of our healthcare delivery. And I just think the starting point for a lot of this is probably, we've had 30 million people on the NHS app. That will probably die unless people begin to see a utility of it, or it will drop off quite dramatically, as any consumer-facing thing does. And it is this point of service delivery, and we should be, I think as a long-term plan, almost start with a really drive home the short-term gains in that to crowd in lots of other benefits and begin to think about then the wider utility of that. I think a personal healthcare account, which means that every time you go to your doctor or each part of the health service, you're not having to reshare the same data. That drives a lot of efficiency gains across the system in and of itself. And then begin to crowd in other service delivery as a part of that. And I think then the multiplier effects, and with a long-term strategy on that, will become quite significant.
Yeah. Any questions from floor? Anybody? Nobody? Okay, right. Well, I'm going to ask then. These are solutions that seem fairly straightforward. Particularly, what you're talking about there is, having patients see their own data, and then, I mean, I use that when I go and see my GP. I try to write everything down and go with it, and so that I know what to ask. And it's not always on the app. Sometimes it doesn't. It falls off. So and these solutions kind of have been around for a while. This isn't that new. So what's preventing us? Is it the politicization? Is it? I know data transparency can be very threatening to many different constituencies because it actually reveals what's happening, which may not be ideal. What are the different factors? I mean, are there behavioral factors or structural factors that we need to, given how simple it is? I don't know. Given how simple it appears to be.
Yeah, it's a difficult question. I actually wanted to ask a question back, but it ties into what you just said, because I was wondering whether you've looked into the whole logistics and production in regard to the Inflation Reduction Act, where you're going to have a focus on biologics, which is going to put an even higher pressure on that. Or what is your view on that? Sorry, I'm...
Yeah.
So pressure on which part?
On the logistics and the CMC and everything which relates to drug development.
Just explain that a little bit more.
Well, because with the IRA, you have a sort of a favorism of biologics, right? The large molecules, because of the exclusivity on the market. It's longer than for small molecules and so forth. And everyone knows that that's more costly, right? It also requires a different logistics than small molecule.
Yeah.
And so coming back to your point before, is that something that has been looked into? Because we at least expect that's going to come some years down the line, and not in a long, actually the near future.
Yeah. So my short answer on this is we are looking into it, and we are doing some work at the moment on what we're basically a big biotech paper and what is the UK's response. And actually, because I think the Inflation Reduction Act has opened up lots of industrial policy questions, both in climate and in health for countries, and they haven't answered them. I don't have a specific answer for you at the moment, but I think you're completely right. And I think a couple of the bits that we are trying to think about within this space is, if I take back to sort of the utility of data question at the beginning as well, I mean, one of the things that has really struck me in the last year, obviously, as it has everyone, is what AI is beginning to open up in drug discovery. And even if you look at what's happening in, say, proteins at the moment, and some of the work that's happening in generative AI for protein discovery, what DeepMind is doing here with both MisSense and its previous thing on it, I think we are probably, and you'll have a better perspective than me on this, so please add on, is that I think we're opening up a completely different pathway for how we get drugs to market. That requires quite deep regulatory discussions as well. But what we then need to think about is going back to my sort of point at the beginning, that we've had things like the biobank, and we've had some areas where and actually even the AlphaFold came off a protein database that was essentially developed in the 70s. How is the public building that infrastructure to get the drugs to the market, or at least drug discovery much, much quicker? But then what are the pathways that it needs to develop? So I know I've gone a bit broad with the answer, not to the specifics, but come back to me in a few months and we'll get back to the specifics on large molecules. Yeah.
Okay, I don't want to go too far down a biotech rabbit hole on this one. No, it's good. It's good. No, but I want to come back to this issue of the list that you gave us, Santiago, around long-term planning, and workforce planning, finding those efficiencies in the health system, in the existing work, investing in prevention, and so on. We've been very successful in incentivizing treatments and diagnostics and in creating a market, a vibrant market, a competitive market, and which has led to some transformative outcomes. What is the right way of going forward in terms of incentivizing? I don't know. Is there a market opportunity? Is there, or is this something that has to be done because there is a fundamental failure in the market in terms of prevention and in other aspects of care that would really bring efficiency to our health systems? And that's a question for anyone, and I guess.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose that part of it could be a private market failure, but part of it is also a little bit government failure, in a sense that, some of these interventions could actually, I think it's typically the small run costs that actually are preventing us from achieving the long-term gains. Reforming hospital financing or whatever is actually riddled with complexity in the short run, and there's lots of hospital managers who actually feel very insecure about that and are worried about what this could achieve. And I think that it would be much better if we move to a position of greater budgetary transparency, more adequate budgets that actually reflect the effort that is really put in, etc., etc. But in the short run, there is a lot of fear, and I think for governments, the incentives to actually get involved with that are few, because it's a complicated issue. And I think this applies to many of these issues. So I think that what we can do about that is that we can try to put decisions on the table, talk about them, describe them in the different reports that we prepare, and hope to actually put these issues in the public sphere so that eventually the political incentives for fixing them are there. And
I turn to industry colleagues here. I guess there's one of the things that you're often coming up against, I guess, is the affordability question, and so it's, I guess. And yet, if there's 20 to 40% wastage in our, there is potentially the financial headroom for medicines that we currently are worried about, and for therapeutics. So, it's in your interest, I guess, to engage on that issue. How easy is it to engage on those sorts of things? I mean, what does one do if one's trying to engage to create the financial headroom for advanced therapeutics and so on, in terms of improving efficiency in the rest of the healthcare chain?
Yeah. I think you'll find many examples of industry working in partnership with NHS organisations to help improve efficiency, smooth the pathway for new therapeutics, support earlier diagnosis, help with workforce planning. These are all really important steps that can improve the efficiency of healthcare organisations and make sure patients ultimately are getting faster access to therapies. Those partnerships are sometimes easier than others to put in place, but we'll often find incredible appetite for that from clinicians on the ground who ultimately share the same priority, which is for patients to benefit and for us all to be better and healthier into the future.
Has that provoked any questions, or are we still going to be... No? Any questions? Yes? Good. It's nearly lunchtime. That's probably what the issue is. No? Thank you.
Hi, my name's Ben, and I'm from Denton's Global Advisors. There's a lot of nationalities and countries represented on this panel today. Are there any markets or health systems or governments that you see that are starting to get this right? You know, you use the climate change example. I'm sure experts in that field would be able to point at different markets or different countries around the world that are really, taking a lead and delivering to show benefits. Bringing it back to the questions that you've been discussing today, are there any markets that are doing that in this area?
So from my lens of the pharmaceutical industry and life sciences, I'd maybe point to two. One close to home. The UK government has taken a mission-type approach to applying and building a life sciences industrial strategy involving charities, scientific organisations, industry, and the full breadth of the public sector. I think that's incredibly positive. There are still many challenges along the way to making that a reality. We heard from Sir John Bell earlier, and he's one of the key figures in driving that forward. Elsewhere, we also heard from Spain earlier, and Spain's had a huge success in increasing participation in clinical research. And that was in direct response to the economic crisis and some of the challenges with inequalities in Spanish patients' access to clinical trials. They took a robust interventional approach at a national level to incentivize clinical research, to strip away bureaucracy and simplify the regulation. And as a result, Spanish clinical trials have massively accelerated. They're now one of the biggest markets in Europe to research new therapies. So Spanish patients are benefiting, the Spanish economy is benefiting.
You know, we're seeing exactly that, right? So for biotech companies, they go to Spain now to do their clinical trials. So in fact, that's a very good example of where you take action and then there's an immediate consequence in a good way, right? And then I would say the other thing I can echo also UK, and how do we see it from a venture capital perspective is that there is here an interest and a desire to bring people together from different disciplines. So every time we have a situation or we want to change something very, very fast, you have the right people coming together to try and put down some suggestions for how this can look. We don't see the same proactive coming together activities yet in a lot of other European countries. So both when it came to COVID, but also when it has come to some of these new US regulatory changes that we need to act on from a European perspective. It's the UK that is acting first and comes together first.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much to add actually to that. I mean, I think there's some different approaches in health systems which can always be learnt across as well. Someone like Singapore has been thinking quite deeply about that sort of life cycle effect of health as well. Obviously, that comes from a slightly different political model and a social consensus model, which meant probably it's harder to then work out how to sometimes read across that where somewhere like the UK might have a little bit more opposition to health data being collected in certain ways, and you have to get to different design principles. But I do think the UK has done, I think it's right, an incredible job on lots of this, and co-creation with industry. I mean, even the clinical trials infrastructure that we scaled up during COVID, I mean, it was almost one of the insane decisions that the government then tried to make to try and break that down when you actually built up like an incredible repository of health data, which then could be utilized for lots of other pathways. And I think the more that we can think about that and that co-creation and pull out some of those examples around the world so we can move at the speed that we need to in digital health and to actually get these therapeutics onto the market, the better.
Yeah, I suppose my example would also come from the UK. I used to work for NHS England, and one of the things that I always liked was that there was this whole unit of analysts that were trying to look at the NHS tariff, how much is paid for different interventions, and were trying to optimize it by changing how much was paid and giving the right incentives to the different NHS trusts. And sometimes they achieved amazing things with that in terms of improving outcomes for patients, reducing expenditure. And I think that kind of work is an example of really what can be achieved within health systems to actually make them more cost effective, and is the kind of intervention I would like to see across EU countries.
It's a good question, and if I might chip in as well. I mean, it made me think. There's, these sorts of institutions that might have been set up in different countries that have actually transcended different governments from different parties. I mean, NICE is an example. I know we might have arguments about whether, but they implemented protocols, actually guidelines of care, as well as the HTA processes. That's a good example, I guess. The NHS directory for genomic testing, which again, people might argue about the details of it, but again, that's transcended, and it has been a long-term planning, and the European Beating Cancer Plan and the European Mission on Cancer, which is, so I think there are these things. So actually, it's having an anxiolytic effect on me, this this discussion. It's good. Any other questions?
Working? Hi, Dimitri from Bristol Myers Squibb. So maybe a question for Mr. Santiago Ramos from DG ECFIN. So obviously, DG ECFIN plays an important role in macroeconomic coordination within the Eurozone and formulates recommendations for budget management and fiscal policy. I remember, following the sovereign debt crisis, healthcare was clearly an area to squeeze in terms of budgets. And then that changed at some point. I think it changed maybe 5 years ago, and healthcare started to be seen as more of an investment from your perspective. So am I off base? Is that true? And what's the current doctrine, I guess?
Okay, yeah. So basically, when the European semester, which is the process by which the Commission gives recommendations to the member states, was set up, it was basically with a purely fiscal base as a response to the financial crisis. And as time went on, more dimensions were added, because in a sense, it became a more rounded system. So in a sense, we still give recommendations in terms of fiscal sustainability and cost effectiveness of healthcare systems, but now we also give recommendations on accessibility, quality of care, etc., on which typically my colleagues from DG Santé or DG Employment work. So in a sense, it's sort of the same principles, but as the fiscal situation eased, the strength of the recommendations, of course, also eased, and the semester became more rounded. I would say that now it's more holistic, and we look at health systems more as a whole. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
I think probably people are ready for lunch, and I think it's a very, very good, it's been an excellent session. So thank you very much to all of you. Quasi-eternal problem, but I think they're really helpful, and it was great to have those. Thank you for asking that question, which gave us some hope and some good examples actually of where we can go forward. Thank you. Great.